Hey, folks, welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. So, joining us on the podcast this afternoon is Philipp Cross, author of The Other Trench, the WW1 Diary and Photos of a German Officer. The Other Trench is the detailed and fascinating recounting of one man's war experiences, but it is also a moving work of rediscovery, connection to ancestors, and a sense of return, and I even believe redemption. We get all of this in one book because the diary author was one Alexander Pfeiffer, a lieutenant in a German Jaeger battalion. And it was his great great grandson, Philip, who turned that diary into this new book with a great deal of love and care. Not only are we able to read the experiences of a German officer in the Great War, but we are also able to watch a descendant of that officer reconnect with his family's past, as well as help others reconnect with the wartime past of their ancestors as well. So, from the book's website, theothertrench.com, here's a description of this new work. From the trenches in France to the mountains of Eastern Europe and the landscapes of Italy, step into the life of Alexander Pfeiffer, a company commander within one of the most prestigious and utilized battalions of the Imperial German Army. Covering over 4 full years of continuous tough combat and service, The Other Trench offers one of the most visual, touching, and brutal accounts of the Great War through his many photographs, authentic diary, and connections to people and the world we live in today. Co-authored by his English great-great-grandson, this book also offers narrations, research, and stories that intertwine the past with the present. It brings a chronicle and an interesting family history to life, as well as fully shedding light on the German perspective, but also that of the opposing sides during the war. The authenticity of this diary provides a unique insight into the life of an ordinary soldier during this era, all while elevating the reader's understanding of what was witnessed to the next level. Philip, thank you so much for coming on the podcast this afternoon. I wanted to say what I alluded to earlier was, so I'm a guy of a certain age, and I suspect most of the folks who listen to the podcast are people of my age, maybe a little bit older. No disrespect meant. So when you first contacted me through email and said, I've got this book and it's about my great great grandfather, I we as humans, we just make pictures in our head of like what folks are going to look like. And so when I got your advanced copy and I saw the picture of you, Philip is very much younger, and I started reading that I think you were born in the mid-90s.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So I think around the time you were 3, a 20-year-old me was getting stationed over in Germany.
Okay.
as a soldier in the U.S. Army. So I was like, oh wow, like,
yeah.
And to read about the 90s, I'm not saying that I am getting old. It's just that, man, like the 90s were quite some time ago. So
yeah,
it was just really, really cool. But I appreciate the work that you've put into this, and you bring, and we'll talk more about it, but like you bring a very mature, and I don't even know how to say it, like a holistic experience into this book. Like it's not just your great great grandfather's war diary. There's a lot in there about you as well, and I find it fascinating. So I'm psyched to learn a little bit more about you, and I'll just kick it off here with the first question, which is if you would, Philip, please tell us about yourself, your family background, and how you grew up.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, you already know, but the ones who haven't read the book yet are probably wondering, what on earth is an English fellow with an English accent doing with a German war diary? So I'll explain. So basically, my father met my mother while he was stationed in Germany in the 90s. I was born over there. and lived there for a year until we relocated to England, in the north of England, to be exact. And growing up, I was completely bilingual. Spoke only German to my mother. When my brother was later born as well, it was the exact same, and it was religious. Culture-wise as well. I picked up cultures from both nations, and so we always had this really deep connection to Germany, even though I was raised over here in England.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent a lot of time in Germany as well. Hearing the stories of my family. Spending Christmas over there. So so even which I explain in the book, at times you have a bit of a like a conflict within yourself. Like some of you feel more German than English, because I had German TV at home. I just spoke German, and my friends saw me as German, but so you couldn't relate with a lot of things at times, even though I was only 50-50, well, 50% of German and 50% English. So, but this isn't, it's not, it's a lot of people they're in a similar situation. So, but this kind of leads into the family history and so forth. It's the family history of my mother's side which is so unique. So my mother's father, to be exact, his descendants, they came from a very very wealthy family in Thuringia, in a place called Weida. So they were textile manufacturers. So this the late 19th century, and they had a lot of money. They could afford paintings. They could afford expensive jewelry, They preserved a lot of things, documents, and it just always got passed down to each generation. And when I was in, spending time in Vida every now and then, we'd see this big family house. It was like something you'd expect, Mozart to live in. It was just huge. It was built in 1720. You'd go in, it was like a big, you'd have a big entrance and go into it. And there was a big courtyard, with buildings, about 3 rows of or 3 stories on each side, surrounding the courtyard. And this is where the Pfeiffers, this big family, lived in, which will kind of lead into the life of Alexander Pfeiffer. It was basically my great grandmother, my mother's dad's mother, who was the daughter of Alexander Pfeiffer, and she basically, my family relocated to West Germany, and she followed my grandfather, and didn't live too far from where they eventually settled. And her apartment, it was an average size apartment, but she had all these things from her parents, these paintings, these furniture pieces from like 1750, and they all had a story connected to them. She knew exactly who these people were, what the relationship was to them. They had she had this big book of the family tree going back to 1300, 1400 that her and her father worked on. And you'd go into it, just smelled like a museum. It was insane. There was stuff in there. It belonged in at the White House, like big mirrors. It was just on this big apartment, in this small apartment, but on this wall, covering the whole wall. And it belonged in a big manor house or a mansion. So it was always normal for my family to have these things, to the point where you just didn't even pay attention to any of the stories that were told, because she would always go on about it. She only died, my great grandmother, this is, when she was 98, 2017. So we have very fond memories of her and the stories she would pass down. But unfortunately, my mother's father died when I was only 11. So that is kind of where it leads to Alexander's story and the stuff that we inherited. And the reason being is Alexander partly raised my mother's father, because my my grandfather's father wasn't in the picture because after World War II, the country split and he was on the west and the east. So Alexander took over the father figure. So all these items, the war items and so forth, all the knowledge that he passed on to Gunter, my mother's father, when he passed away, it came to us. So that's a bit of a background on my family history and how it leads to Alexander's story, basically.
Man, Thuringia, was that a part of East Germany?
Yeah, so in German it's Thüringen, Thuringia. It was part of East Germany. So after the Second World War, it became communist. So yeah, but my mother was born. I was born in West Germany.
Yep.
Because of the relocation due to unforeseen circumstances and so forth. So yeah,
and I imagine that is the Pfeiffer family house. Is that still in your family, or no longer at this point?
No, I mean, it was up until about 10 years ago. So the textile company, which we'll go into a bit more detail towards the end, after the war and so forth, it got the communist state. They seized all the assets. They kept the house and all the possessions, and in the house itself, but just the business and everything else along with it. And then when the family got bigger, people just branch off, have their own separate lives, and there's no need to maintain, and it costs too much to maintain the place. But I was lucky enough to visit various times and see what it was like, and it's something like out of a film. It's insane, just all these family portraits on the wall.
I can imagine.
And yeah, it was really interesting. But then there's all these extra separate stories that go along with it, which I'll just be tempted to go off track a bit if we get to that. So
no worries. Yeah, so this is amazing. Talking about you brought that up again, like the remembering those smells, like which I can totally understand certain places and like what they smell like in people and like I don't know, it's part of like the aura that they leave behind, or the aura that they carry with them. I totally understand that. So just can you tell us about Alexander Pfeiffer, your great grandfather, and the world he lived in? You mentioned that he obviously he grew up pretty wealthy, but maybe just round him out a little bit more. His German life, I guess.
Yeah, so like his roots, I suppose. So the family mentioned the Pfeiffers. There were three brothers in the mid to late 1800s, and they all had different, like sons and so forth. And each family, side of family, so each brothers, their family lived in a separate part of the house. So Alexander had he had two brothers and a sister, and as you can imagine, very wealthy, had an exceptional education, and the garden, which I was lucky enough to visit various times, huge. It was like a park, and they had maid service. The whole house was probably just like a playground. There was so many rooms. They were very. I mean, he knew Latin. He could speak English. He learned French. And even in the book, you'll see some of the drawings and his own writing when he was 12, and you can just see how articulated it would have been and intelligent to be able to come up with something like that at such a young age. So growing up, he wanted to be a pediatrician. So because of his destined role as this director of this family business, we're talking the late 1800s, early 1900s. It just wasn't possible. You were born into that. That's what you will be doing.
Right.
Kind of like royalty at the time. It was very upper class. They had their set path. And that's what they had to do.
Gilded cage, right? Like
it was like a structure, wasn't it? Of like the way things had to be done, and he therefore joined. So they probably had the option to join one of the elite, so go into the military. So we joined the 12th Saxon Jaeger Battalion, which was like an elite branch of the German army at the time. So they specialised in like skirmishing tactics and so forth. Came from the upper class because they recruited from people who own land and were like foresters, Jaegers, huntsmen, so forth. And these people at the time owned land, and you had to be wealthy to do so. And he's worked his way up the ranks. I believe he was in the army for about 4 to 6 years. I can't give the exact number, but he became a sergeant, platoon leader. And during his time so once his service was over, he became a reserve while doing training every now and then, I believe. So, I mean, the knowledge we have on that period between 1900 and 1910 is it's not very significant, to be honest. But he maintained his duties in the textile industry.
Okay.
And he married his wife, Johanna. They had 2 children. So this is probably around 1910. And then when the war broke out, I suppose that's when he was called up as a reserve, as a platoon leader. But he was in the 11th Hessian Jaeger Battalion. Again, we don't have much knowledge on why or any information on why. It could have been a transfer, or it could have been, it might not have had a choice. We're not really sure. But yeah, I hope that sums it up in a way. But like I always say to people, these were, like his background, he was very wealthy. You've ever seen Titanic, you've seen these people in the first class,
Yeah.
kind of compartments. That's what they would have been like in a way. Very, very posh, very, very articulated, possibly a bit snobby. They usually got their way. His wife Johanna was from a similar circle, so they came from a background of musicians and vicars. So her descendant was Karl August Saxe Weimar. So he was a great grandson of King George I, Great Britain. So this Karl August was like a duke or a king of Saxony at the time, late 1700s, early 1800s. Mm-hmm. So they were very quite prestigious, not nobility, so to say, but very upper class and had links to nobility and dukes and so forth. And hopefully that sums it up nicely.
Yeah. He strikes me as like I think Warren and Marty here too have probably encountered this a lot, like in a lot of exchanges, sometimes between German and I'm thinking now British officers in histories that I've read, like there's like always the Germans like always speak English, and they're always like, they're always like, yeah, like I know London quite well. I used to work there, and I can imagine your great grandfather being a similar type of like well-rounded, like very well educated, very worldly individual. Mm-hmm. So fascinating. Mm-hmm. Now this is really cool too, and I commend you on this, is that you grew up with all of these artifacts around you, and you grew up steeped in this history, knowing that it was it's always been there, but then you rediscovered your great grandfather's diary, even though you knew it had been there. So what caused you to rediscover it, and like how did that make you feel when you like really got into it and were like, wow, look, check this out?
So I mean, just I should have mentioned sooner. So the way we got the diary is because my mum's father passing away. Mm-hmm. So I was 11. So we always knew about this diary in the family. People always, I was told, this Alexander Pfeiffer. We always heard stories about him, and how he was an officer who had a lot to say. He used to say to me. So I'm assuming that he had a lot of authority and probably had like a leadership role. And we knew about the diary. People who read it in Germany were always fascinated about it. But, when you're 15, 16, you don't really. I was interested in history. I always have been, but not. Might read a page or so, but you won't. That's that, and you just want to play Xbox or something.
Totally. Yeah.
It's just the way it was. So yeah, it was basically when I was probably in my early 20s. Was more mature, more switched on, and I'd already just naturally developed more of an interest in my heritage and history in general. And it was actually during the start of 2020, right before COVID, and I was employed at the time, waiting to start my new job, which was quite a few months to that before that, and I just, for some reason, I just had this weird urge to find these postcards or get them out there, and just start looking at them, researching them. And I just thought, well, I want to know how this person died. So I got the diary out and I started going to the relevant dates. And then I realized, bloody hell, this is insane. Like how the hell did he survive all it? And then I read that he was the commander of this sector that was being attacked, and how hundreds, up to 500 Scotsmen, so the men that belonged to this soldier who had the postcard, his regiment belonged to, how they were just mowed down, and how, all the stories that were involved. And then I just started to show my friend here in England who's very interested in history, and I started to translate the extracts just for him to read. And he always knew about the diary, but he always thought it was probably just a scrapbook, which you commonly get, or just a few notes here and there. And when he realized, this is like almost like a novel in parts, absolutely insane. He just said, "You need to do something with this." And I just started reading it from the start. First one page turned to two, as I mentioned in the book. Then it turned to 10, 20, and it was just like you were with him the whole time, because he was so consistent with it as well. And you knew exactly where he was, and how these situations even like materialized. You just really started to connect to it. And yeah, it was just different stages. So it was the translation at first, which took about 6 months. And it wasn't like I just did that and then just every day since then. Maybe had like 2 months doing nothing. And then I found extra bits here and there, postcards, did a bit of research. And then I got in touch with like an agent who kind of advised me on how to maybe improve it, adding my own personal experiences in there and so forth. I thought, it's so much hard work, but then it had to be done. It was like all this stuff I wanted to do with it. And then I started polishing up the translation. And then, things with the postcards, doing a bit more research into that, which we'll probably go into later, meeting the family of one of the soldiers connected to the postcard. All in all, it took me about 4 years to get to stage, 4.5 years. And then I found extra pictures to go along with this. It was just insane. So I was so involved in this diary at this point in time. It was about 2 to 3 years ago. I was in Germany visiting my grandmother, and I found a big bag of this album with an iron cross printed onto it.
Wow. I
was like, oh my God, and everything was dated, big descriptions on the rear. I was like, it's a history goldmine here. I was like, I need to get these scanned. I need to put them in the book. And then I found more pictures. I'm talking envelopes, stacks of envelopes. I wish I had them here with me, but I'd show you otherwise. Just like these pictures with explanations on the back, anything from, there was even one with a dead fallen Scottish captain, trench building, everything. Like it was, and they all went hand in hand with these extracts. And when I realized I could piece them together, like a jigsaw,
Yeah.
And in a way, like finish what he probably would have done himself if he was still here today.
Hmm.
Um, to kind of complete that his project, which is what I did. I mean, it took so many hours scanning everything, putting them into the diary, editing everything myself, formatting it all. I did 2 extra proofs of the translation to make sure it's 100% accurate. AI checked every sentence. It became like such a like a not an obsession, but like a duty in a way to which I had to fulfill.
Hmm.
Um, and it was just something I really enjoyed doing, like a full-time hobby. In a way, I'm kind of upset that it's come to an end. I mean, my wife's probably happy that I'm not spending so much time editing or doing other things related to the diary itself. But yeah, that's how it kind of came to be. It was a kind of an epic journey for myself, and so many people involved and the traveling and so forth, which we'll probably get to as well.
Yeah. I know you mentioned duty, but then you also mentioned like, it sounds like a real passion. Like you really took on this passion for this project, and it comes through in the way you're explaining it,
Mhm.
and you're describing the process. I was thinking I was going to ask, like, like how did your family feel? Did they go from like, oh, that's cool, he's interested in his family, to being like, oh my god, he's like really, really.
Yeah, I think it was when at the start, yeah, I mean, I was still living at home at the time with my mother, and she was like, living in the past, you need to, do all these translations. I was like, I need to do it. Well, she didn't. Now she's so, proud of me and what I've done, and she's read it herself. And with the German edition coming out next month, she's like
Really
helping me edit. Yeah, so
fantastic.
she's helped, like I do a lot of some of the editing. She's read it all. Like she's just as engrossed as I am now, and because it's our ancestor, it makes it even more special. And realizing as well, I mean, which you probably realized yourself, I mean, it's not just a diary. I mean, it's like a chronicle of, such a gold mine of the albums. I mean, there's just nothing like it on either side. I mean, I did a bit of research on German war diaries. It was Ernst Singer, Storm of Steel, a few of the other ones that stood out, even on the British, the French, the other side. Nothing, with the photos and so, there was just nothing like it. So obviously, when I realised that, it just pushed me to keep going on and on, getting it out there, no matter how long it took and how much effort I had to put into it. And then you got to realize I only was able to fit about 2/3 of the images in that book. There's still a third. I couldn't get them in there because it would
Wow.
have been like a
Coffee
massive
table.
dictionary or something. Yeah, like, but yeah, that's something. Future projects perhaps that
Yeah.
can
Wow.
benefit from that. I suppose.
Amazing. I'm going to assume the answer here is no, but I wonder if you know. So the British Army, it was policy that soldiers were forbidden from like having cameras on
Mm-hmm.
them and photographing the trenches. And in the American Army in World War I, they were forbidden from keeping diaries because they could be captured and they could give away information. That was the reasoning behind it. I'm I'm assuming, and of course, it's always dangerous to do so, but I'm assuming the German army must have also had rules like that. But for your
Mm-hmm.
great great grandfather to have maintained such a meticulous
Mm-hmm.
diary and photographs, those rules were in place. They obviously weren't.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting as well. I forgot to mention at the start. He told his wife of this plan to make this diary, so it's not like his handwriting, scribbled notes that we have. He kept sending the notes home on a regular basis, and then he typed it up after the war was over. So it was probably like every time he went on, on leave or away, he probably brought them. with him or sent them home. The images as well. Someone asked me about this today at the launch event, and I did a bit of research on this. And the Germans were supposedly quite laid back when it came to photographing, creating photos on the front lines, as long as it didn't interfere interfere with their their kind of duties, or in battle and so forth. Which is why you get so many more photos from the German side. I mean, you can go on eBay, which I've done, and you can find pictures of like training, Germans in training or trenches and so forth, whereas there's nothing on the British side whatsoever, which is why this book is so unique, because it is the diary and all these, albums, all these photographs, which go hand in hand with the entries, which is just, but it's such a rare thing. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Definitely. All right. So where does Alexander first experience combat with his battalion, the 11th Hessian Jaeger Battalion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when he was mobilized in August as a reserve, he was doing a bit of training here and there, doing a lot of garrison duties, and he was sent to replace the active battalion, which suffered severe, casualties ahead of Paris, and so forth. So his first, I wouldn't say action, but the first time he probably witnessed bombs going off, shells, and heard the bullets whistle, was near Arleux or Vaviscourt. And in this time, we get the sense of how they went to the trenches, and then he describes what the trenches were like. Obviously, there were a lot of failed attempts of the French to take these trenches, and he explains how there were a lot of colonial troops, Frenchmen, lying dead in front of the field before him. So it was the first time that he really got a sense of a true taste of war, I suppose. And then it's the first time he really describes what the shells sound like, the different calibers, what they could already tell what was a field gun, what was heavy artillery, and the British, who had the naval artillery, naval guns on the canal. And it's during this time as well he explains how the people who replaced him stupidly lit a fire and gave away their position, and they got themselves killed. I believe it was about 20 men. So you could tell they were very inexperienced, didn't really know the dangers, what they were doing. Yeah, probably went in with high hopes, thinking they're invincible, but soon found out that they weren't. It was so after he was in this area, he got sent to the area of Souchez. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Souchez, yeah.
Yep.
And the Loreto Heights, which is how he describes it. And from here, they were tasked to storm this French position on the edge of the forest. So they were against French Alpine Jaegers, or skirmishers, as he describes them. And it was before, bear in mind, positional warfare had really kind of taken place and became a thing. So they were trying to attack these positions by just running across the field, which he did with his platoon. He said he'd never run like that in his life, or as fast as that in his life. He survived, luckily, obviously with heavy losses in his platoon and elsewhere. But the men later on who did the exact same, all 10 got shot down. So this is actually where he was awarded his first Iron Cross, second class. And I was there actually this April of this year, seeing the forest. Now there's a massive French cemetery there, but you can just based on his descriptions, this, kind of imagine where it would have been, and the difficulty, when I was looking at the ridge, running up there against people, who have a clear view of you, and the look he must have had. Well, he definitely had to survive. And this is also where we get an idea of how trench warfare, positional warfare really started to take place, because they were digging themselves in the night. They couldn't get anywhere without being shot, and they just dug foxholes. And he said how the ground was just littered with, rocks, debris, things that made it so hard to dig any further. And he even says he doesn't feel like a warrior, but more like an earth worker. And they'd eventually have these foxholes, because I used to always ask myself, how did they build the trenches when the enemy was over there at the start? And based on how he describes it, they had these foxholes and they just dug to the next foxhole, and then they connected, and then they dig to the next one. And that's how it develops. And if they had to go to the rear, they just dug a communication trench and so forth. So that was, this was, you're talking like September, October 1914.
Yep.
And then you can see how they started digging in, and it just kind of went from there. Turned into a bit of a stalemate, so to say.
Yeah. Wow. So he's there right in the beginning. So like the Souchez, Notre Dame de Lorette. Yeah. There's the huge French cemetery there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So we've got, all right. So now this is one of the most moving parts of the book for me, is Alexander's connection to Percy Walsh. So this was one of the most, this is where I felt that sense of return. And I apologize if I'm not using this word correctly, but I feel like the word redemption keeps coming in my head, and it's not a great wrong was done, but like Percy Walsh was a warrior, as was your great-great-grandfather. And I think the great wrong here is the war itself that pushed them both onto this battlefield. But I feel that this part of the book is very, very moving. So can you tell us about Alexander's connection to Percy Walsh?
Yeah, so it's kind of what I just explained is kind of it leads nicely into this. So when he was stationed around the areas of La Bassée, and he'd survived the Battle of La Bassée and so forth, they were basically stuck in the trenches over winter. Obviously, the British desperately tried to, push through the German lines before the winter really kicked in. And it was just around Christmas time, so the week leading up to Christmas. And to me, it's one of the most insane chapters, and parts of the book. The detail it goes into, we know exactly how these events kind of unfolded. So the British captured one of the German trenches. Germans suffered terrible losses, which he explains in vivid detail. You've read it yourself, the gore, the people just getting absolutely obliterated, shredded by the artillery and so forth. And when the Germans then pulled back to the second line, so the rear trench, they decided to take revenge, take back the trench that was taken from them, which he did, as he describes, with hand grenades, fixed bayonets. He said they didn't really use guns much during this time. They just had sacks of grenades and just launched these grenades continuously at the British, shelled them to pieces, and then suffered barely any losses at all, whereas the British suffered hundreds. And it was during this time, so just around Christmas, when they were obviously in these recaptured trenches, and there he was, all the English soldiers, Percy Walsh, which I'll get into now, a lot of Indian Gurkhas, where he, later describes having found loads of letters and so forth. And when they were clearing up these trenches, of course, they found, they were taking socks, scarves, hats, everything possible that they could use, food and so forth. And a lot of them would have, if they had took a jacket of an English soldier, there's a letter in there, postcard, probably just something he kept for himself, just to, probably not to be disrespectful at all, but, once you get to know Alexander, it was probably just a way to honour him, I suppose, or to kind of remember him. I don't know. I mean, only he would have known why, but I'm glad he did, because this Percy Walsh, I'll get to how I know he's called Percy Walsh in a second. He, in a way, he's lived on because of this. He was always part of my family, and was always just kind of like his postcard was always. My mother remembers seeing it in the cabinet. She'd sometimes look at it through the glass. My grandfather, some mother's father, would look at it, show people, and explain the story. So, and how it came to be. So when I was doing a bit of research for, my book and so forth, I just had to know who this Percy was. And for those who haven't read the book, seen the postcard, it just says, "With love from us all, to Percy." And there's a picture of a soldier with a rifle lying on the ground. Some women in the background, some other men from a different regiment, and tapped in Percy in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database. Used Alex's reports to determine exactly where he was. I mean, he drew maps and so forth. You knew exactly what road he was fighting on, and that led me to find out what regiment he was against. And it was the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment, which is in the same region where I was raised, pretty much, here in England. It's insane. So I had a lot of help from Facebook, research groups. So, I post inquiries in there, trying to find this soldier, can anyone give some advice? This was about 3-4 years ago. And somebody signposted or showed me this website that was kind of dedicated to the history of Blackburn, which is where this Percy would be from. And we found a picture of Percy Walsh, and a newspaper article of, assuming it was his wife, inquiring about his whereabouts because he was missing. However, we know the reason why he was missing because he was in the recaptured trenches with the Germans. And from there, I contacted the library in Blackburn, visited a historian who was very interested, and somebody working from the library. And we just got talking. They showed me the Roll of Honour, the picture of him. I showed them the postcard. And after this, I managed to find the family, one of the relatives of this Percy Walsh, who was actually the grandson of Percy Walsh's brother. So that was incredible. Once I knew I had a living, a living relative, to this man, somebody who I could talk to, was connected to this postcard. It was just insane, so close to where I was raised. I mean, 20-minute drive away, 25-minute drive away. It was just incredible. And I arranged to meet them in Blackburn, and it's very emotional. It was not that I started crying or anything, but it was very very touching, and to sharing the stories. And it was over a century later, just this in a different time, different circumstances, kind of bringing closure to kind of what happened back then, under the most horrible circumstances. And I gave the postcard back to them. They were really, really nice family. And I saw them today, the book event. They brought the postcard with them, and I explained pretty much this that I just told you and the viewers. And it was yeah, and they live very close to me, like literally 5 minutes away. I just think the coincidence, the
Yeah.
he could have picked up a different postcard. He could have been lost, and that would have been it, gone. The entire kind of story, everything that goes along with it. Percy Walsh, he would have been erased from memory. I mean, they didn't know much about him at all, apart from the fact that he had a relative who served, and again, this it's mentioned in the book, but we had, with the help of the historian who helped me at the start, we discovered, why he was in England, how the post, where the photo was taken, how it got to France, how the circumstances surrounding his death and so forth. And then I go into the regimental history somewhat, and what the regiment had to endure overall. Yeah, it was very moving, very moving. But it's not something that I'll ever forget. It's one of these stories I'll always pass down, to my kids and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I that part I was, like I said, like very, very moved by it, and you're right. It is like a closure. Like Alexander's, for whatever reason, he picked up that postcard, and gosh, like fate, like fate puts it into your hands, and you then
Yeah. Yeah.
reconnected with the family of that young
Mm,
man. So amazing, amazing.
yeah. I mean, that there were so many. I mean, there's a few. I've got them here. I mean, this was found as well during that time. Well, there's not much in. So it's a bit of a glare from the screen, but he just wrote, because he documented everything so well. He wrote, uh, "This is the regiment against which we fought, Christmas 1914," and that those were the Welsh Fusiliers. And from these as well, a little one of the badges.
Yeah,
So yeah, it was. I mean, he says they just took stuff out of the bags, the knapsacks, So it's probably whatever they found. They probably just kept, or it was on the floor. They just picked it up, and then it probably just landed in his possessions, and he sent it home. But we won't really know the full story of that,
yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah. And
Mm.
it's just very typical soldiers' behavior. Like you're fascinated by the other side, and certainly coming into contact with them, like you're gonna want to something to remember them by, some kind of like souvenir, and it's just the way it is. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So this ties in with the whole story with Percy, Percy Walsh and everything. Is in the book. This is a little bit off topic here, but you talk about that butterfly effect, and that's something that fascinates me as well. And I think of it often too, and how like one small action can create something way different down the line. In regards to this book, what did the butterfly effect mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all think about that sometimes. I mean, when I was younger, I'd speak to my grandparents and they'd say, "Oh, if I hadn't missed my bus and gone to, that pub, I wouldn't have met your grandfather. You wouldn't be here." So you hear all these stories,
Yep.
from different sides, and it does, you do think about that. Gosh, if I wouldn't have, with my wife personally, if I wouldn't have been there at that exact second, at that time, the whole our lives would be, completely different. And with this, Alexander, it's every every action he took, everything that he did, just it's affected. I mean, I wouldn't be here. You think that postcard, if he wouldn't have picked the postcard up, the family today wouldn't be here. They'd be leading a whole different life of this day. They would have had different plans, which would have affected, the lives of other people that they would have interacted with, or wouldn't have interacted with. So it's just this like ripple effect, and it got me thinking, it's like something that I mentioned about as well, like be mindful of what you do, because everything that we do in the present, no matter how big or small, it has some sort of a ripple effect, a butterfly effect. Oh yeah, I mean, there's so many instances. You think I talk about this in the book, how the English soldier shot Captain Clausen next to Alexander, and I'm assuming he either died or suffered horrible, horrible injuries. But you think, what? Why was that English soldier on watch that day? If it was someone else, would he have aimed left instead of right? And what led to that soldier being there in the first place? If it would have been another soldier who would have passed away, died, or whatever the circumstances would have been, we couldn't be here, we wouldn't be here talking today. I wouldn't be here. My family, my wife would be living a entirely different life. And it affects the future generations as well, who will come to exist. Everyone who's reading the book, who's read the book, which I talk about, what would you be doing if you weren't reading this book today? What alternate life would you be leading? So, I mean, I picked out some examples on that section, but you could apply that to everything in the diary, I suppose. And it was just down to his luck, and other people being not so fortunate. If others would have been lucky, then he wouldn't have been, he might not have been so lucky on the other hand. So yeah, it boggles my mind even just talking about it. You just think, wow, it's. But yeah, it means a lot to me. But yeah, I think the message that people should take from it is just, cherish the time you have, and be mindful of the actions, that you take, because they have no matter how big or small, they do have a lasting impact.
Yeah, that's very, very insightful, and that's very good, and it's something that I think we get caught up in the data in the day to day affairs of our lives, and as some people say, like we're in the trenches, during the day,
Yeah.
and I think it's good to like remember that every once in a while, remind ourselves of like, hey, like be mindful of like what you're doing, because it does
Yeah. Yeah.
go into the future. So
Mm.
amazing. Thank you for that. That's a
Yes.
fantastic answer. So the other trench, and as you've been speaking about with Percy Walsh and the Welsh regiment that fought against your great great grandfather here, you got a lot of research of the units opposing Alexander, and result is we get a lot of helpful context that rounds out the diary entries. Can you speak a little bit about what it was like to learn about the other side, the British
Mm.
troops who were fighting your grandfather at that time?
Yeah. I mean, it was really incredible. I mean, what led to me wanting to research about the English side was, the postcards. And the first, well, obviously Percy Walsh, which we spoke about. But before Percy Walsh, because there was more information on the postcard, it was Joseph Langford. We had his regiment on there, the King's Own Scottish Borderers. We had, a message on there. We could really find out, or I could really find out who this person, who he was, and it was easy to trace. And this was before I probably even, really started translating the diary and working on the book. It was finding about the King's Own Scottish Borderers, the Battle of Lewes, what did these men go through? And, in school and so forth, here in England, we did have, you know, we got it, we got the English perspective, most of the time, what they went through, all these major battles, the Somme, Lewis has slightly touched upon, the first big British, or the gas attack against the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
And it once I started delving into their stories and reaching out to these Facebook groups, research groups, I got people messaging me, "Oh, my granddad or my great uncle was exactly opposite your ancestor and were mowed down and killed by Madpoint." So the position that Alexander eventually commanded. And there's a man called Chris who still in touch with at times to this day, and he collected German pictures from this, from the German side, Auchi, as Mines, and these places where Alexander was stationed, and he then started to explain how his great uncle, I believe it was now, off the top of my head, he wrote his own short memoirs, wrote a bit about stuff. After the war, he wrote his own memoirs about the battles that he survived, the Battle of Festubert. And when we discovered that Alexander and I think it was his great grandfather, great uncle, were directly opposite each other, and talked about the exact same shot down German machine gun unit, which you might remember, they got to this trench and there was a dead unit of German machine gunners, and it was mentioned on the English side as well. So it was the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire light infantry, I believe.
Yep.
And he was either a lieutenant, or another rank of officer. And it was just, using them. And one of the extracts that I used, I retrieved from the archives, was implementing that into the book. And it was something that he could connect to as well, Chris, because it was like that was his ancestor or his relative.
Yeah.
So it was like, because I live here, it's easy to reach out to historian groups, and just regular people interested in history who have such an interest in, what their relatives went through. It was them reaching out to me, telling me their stories and providing me with information, which was just really, really interesting. So then you had these two side-by-side comparisons, and just realized, because I translated it to English, it could be either side. They just went through the exact same thing, but they were just fighting against each other. Yeah, very, very, very quite emotional at times. And there's a website here I thought it's worth mentioning. It's called A Street Near You, and it's like a Google map type, like a satellite view of Great Britain, and you can see in which house existing today a soldier who died lived. So here we have a lot of houses, terraces, houses built in the Victorian era, and so forth. And you can see, so all these soldiers who Alexander fought against, Kings and Scottish Borderers, all these other regiments, you can filter it down. And where I work, where I lived, these men fought and died against Alexander in that exact same area, because you could tell by the date when they died. And it's just incredible, and then you've got the stories of the regiments to go hand in hand with that. I mean, there was so much I wanted to put into the book from the British side, but there was a point where I just had to draw the line, because you would have had a 600 page like encyclopedia or something. Yeah, it was really, really moving, and a lot of the English, people here, they really appreciate it. A lot of them find it's like possibly even closure, because they researched their ancestors, how they died, their journey so much. Now they've got this other, fresh perspective translated, and presented by someone who's one of them, so to say, so they can relate to it more, because I lived here, I grew up in the same streets where these soldiers lived before they died. It's very, hits close to home.
Wow. Just, this is so remarkable. Like all of the, again, like your, the way you're taking in everything, and the way you're connecting everything, and with the story, it's really, really remarkable. Like what you've done, and how you're explaining everything. It's amazing. It's amazing. Like I keep thinking, like, it's all very like global. Like we get the whole story. We've got
Yeah, yeah,
Alexander and we've got the guys on the in the other trench, and we know who they were and where they lived and what lives they led.
yeah.
Like so incredibly rich. Just amazing work. Moving on here, we've got Alexander's visit home in 1915. He didn't write about it, and I'm wondering if you can maybe shed some insight on why he didn't write about it when he was such a keen observer of events around him.
Mm.
And also, like, did anyone else ever record what that visit was like? Does the memory still remain in your family today?
I mean, yeah, I mean, this is something that I picked up on. My mother, when she first read it, like you said, he goes into so much detail with things happening around him. But when he's at home, for example, you probably remember when he mentions his son dying,
Yeah.
and there's just nothing like. Well, you do sense emotion because when he came back, he explains there's a celebration at Bessol, but he went home at 9 o'clock. And so you can sense that it would have hurt him much more than it did. For example, the time at home, it probably was his only time to relax, and enjoy himself. But he just doesn't talk about it at all. He senses excitement beforehand, but yeah, and I can't give a solid explanation. All we can do is analyze and maybe come up with some sort of an explanation using his background, the family history. They were very keen on record keeping, the family tree, everything. His brother, Friedrich Pfeiffer, he documented, he wrote a big book on the history of Ida. They were very, very intelligent, very, very efficient people who did everything structurally. And I
Mhm.
think when he set out to write this diary, I believe he just wanted to make it like a historical record, about his wartime experiences, of course, what he's going through, but not the emotional side of things. Things that he found were maybe irrelevant or not to do with his service in his Jaeger battalion or as a company commander. That that's how that's why I think he did it the way he did. Or didn't mention the things that we would have expected him to. But unfortunately, my great grandmother, she was born after 9 months after he returned from the war. So she probably, I mean, she's passed away as well. So when I did have the interest or develop the interest, she wasn't there to ask.
Yep.
My mother's father, he died when I was 11. So again, all the people who knew him, they did have a small family afterwards. We just don't really know that much
Yeah.
apart from what we have, in terms of the diary and other records. My mother as well, she wasn't really that interested, if I'm being honest. It was just always around her, and she never really asked. But so yeah, it's just assumption and having to use what we have to build kind of an explanation, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I understand. I understand. Yeah. Yeah. Like things. Yeah. Sometimes things just like we just lose them. Like they
Yeah.
lose them over time. So getting into our final question here is what was Alexander's life like after the Great War ends?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, this is something I touch on in the book,
Mm-hmm.
and it was, yeah. I mean, again, I based on what I've heard,
Mm-hmm.
the stories and so forth. He seemed to live a very normal life. He took over the textile company, so he became the director of the family-run business. Again, very wealthy. During the Weimar Republic, they were still able to go on holidays and treat themselves, whereas other Germans at the time didn't. So, and a lot of photos to support that as well. And he was just like a regular family man, I suppose, outside of his duties in the textile industry. We do know that he joined the Steihe, so with the Veterans Association at the time, which was, again, a time for him to probably meet others who went through the same thing. Lots of people in Vidar, people he knew, they fell, they died in the war. And it's something I mentioned as well. Like, even though he seemed so relaxed and seemed to have such a normal life based on the pictures and the stories we were passed down, the diary, the fact that he recorded everything, the fact that he dedicated his time to compile all this stuff together, label all the photos, and it was probably affected him much more than anyone could think. And back then they didn't have therapy. So it was probably just a way for him to process what the hell he'd just gone through for 4 years, typing the diary out and compiling everything together, the photos. And I even have like newspaper articles that he saved, the Carpathians, and all these regimental stories that he cut out, stuck onto, probably equivalent of like cereal boxes or something at the time. And like, there was a list of all these men from his battalion that fell. A lot of them who he knew, who were mentioned in his diary, stuck onto a cardboard cutout. So, when you see these films and they have like a whiteboard with all these things to connect the dots, pictures, that's what it reminds me of. Probably just as therapy. But yeah, I mean, after the war, or the Second World War, sorry, the communists, took over the family business. Had to be, it just went into ruin, I suppose. Assets were seized. They kept the house and all the items, but everything else was gone. And my mother's father, Gunter, so he really didn't have his real father. His real father wasn't in the picture because of the split of the country. His father was in the West. So Alexander, was in his mid-60s when Gunter was born, took over that father role in a way. Everything that he supposedly knew, he passed on to him. His war items, geography, he was so into his history and geography, and passed that on to Gunter. And then obviously showed him the pictures, everything else that went along with it. And yeah, and when he passed, so he lived a very fulfilling life. He lived to 86. Alexander did, and his wife Johanna died about 8 years before that, in the 70s. And when my mother's father, so Gunter, was an adult, he always said good things about his Alexander, and how wise he was. He was just such a caring man. Very, very, just very like a stoic in a way. Like he was very just intelligent, and everything he knew was just passed on to Gunter. And even my mother's so my grandmother. So she would always say, my granddad, he seemed to know everything. Geography, like these random niche little topics. Astronomy, things that Alexander would have taught him. I don't know if you read this, but in the Eastern Front, Alexander talks about the size of the mountains, just ridiculous little things. Like, he knows what all these flowers are called, stuff that he would have learned when he was in school, or through his, really good education.
Seriously.
And when he died, when he was 86, this legacy was just like passed on. And every time when I was invited, people who knew him, of course, 78, as soon as you mentioned Alexander, Alexander Pfeiffer, he was such a great man, like he was his guru or something. It was really weird. But at the time, you just don't really think about it. You just think, oh well, he was some, I guess he was special. You see pictures of him and so forth. But then when I got older, I just realized I want to know why. Why did these people look up to him so much? And people even said to me when after they've read the diary, you feel like you know him. You feel like you like you're in his mind and can relate to everything he's gone through. And a few of you mentioned like even though they're English, you feel like you're on the side of the Germans and Alexander and one you're rooting
Yeah.
for him, in his company and what he's having to go through. So yeah, I mean, hope that summarizes it in a way.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I know that feeling of how you feel about Alexander when people speak like that about him, because my father's father, in when I would visit Portugal as a child, like during the summers off from school, they would say like, like I was like, I don't know, like 8, 10 years old, and I always remember like they would say like, who are you? And the older guys, and I would say like, oh, I'm Joe's son, and you know a my grandfather's name was Abilio, and I would say like, I'm Abilio's grandson. My grandfather passed away before I was born, but they would say, oh, Abilio, like your grandfather was a great man, and they would just speak with like such reverence. Same way you were just mentioning about Alexander, and
Oh yeah, yeah,
what's really cool is that you're lucky in that you have that diary and his personal effects and stuff like that. Like unfortunately we don't have that like with my grandfather, but
mm-hmm.
so it's really awesome that you have that, because you can it helps you understand like, yeah, I get it, like I can see why,
Yeah.
you know.
He's yeah, and I'm so glad he did everything that he did. And there's just so many weird like stories. I mean, this was my well, he told my so gone to my grandfather then. I'm not going to say where, but apparently he told him a few times that he buried a Luger, somewhere in the. I'm not going to say where,
Yeah, sure.
in a place, you know, and with other things, and in a metal container. And you think, wow, like why, what goes on in your mind to do this? But it's probably just a way to, I don't know, maybe get close, just kind of bury in the past, I
Yep.
suppose, for someone to find his stories but we'll never know. Like it was always passed on. My granddad tried to find it in the locations where he said it might have been. And you just absolutely incredible. And then all these pictures and everything. And when I went to Germany, like you open little cupboards, and there's like some stuff from Alexander in there from his time in, like an Iron Cross ribbon. You think,
Yeah.
what is that doing in the back of this in this drawer? It's insane. But a lot of people who I know, they don't even know who the great grandparents are.
Yep.
Never mind the great great grandfather or grandmother, so forth. So it's yeah, and I'm just glad that they preserved everything because it's we all benefit from it, I suppose.
Yeah.
And people just it just fills like a niche that I felt need to be filled. It was something that's never really been done. And with this book, I just hope that people who read it, they get that, they learn new things from it. And, even if you're new to the topic or you're a veteran and an expert, you will learn something new. So, yeah.
No, fantastic. That it's fantastic work, and we're all richer for having it in book form that we can read now in English and German, which is just amazing. I'm so curious to see how it will be received in Germany. I believe it'll be received very, very
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I
so.
hope so. Yeah. I mean, it's fully self-published as well. So, so I'm everything I've done myself.
Wow.
The artwork. I've had a bit of help doing the graphics design, putting it together, and colorizing, but everything and the marketing and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, talk about it. Spread the word, and it'll just help. kind of get it to a wider audience and get more people to read it. It's obviously been self-published. It just needs a bit of extra,
Sure.
that support.
Sure.
So yeah.
So we have so we're recording this in just about mid-October, but I'm going to be releasing this towards the end of November. So so it's going to be right on time, folks. As you're listening to this, like get in there and order it now so that you can get it for Christmas as a gift to give to others, gift yourself, but you will be very, very pleased. Philip, I'd like to bring Marty, who's still with us here. And Marty, if you have any questions for Philip or anything, now's your opportunity, man. You also get to be the first person, first listener on the podcast, I guess, too.
Hi, Phil. Well, thanks. It's been a pleasure listening to your journey with your great grandfather. Is that right?
To great grandfather.
Great. Okay. So I'm curious about being, if you will, and I've read other accounts. I've read Storm of Steel, and we may have a mutual friend. Do you know Marcus Clower?
Marcus Clower. The name rings a bell.
Marcus has written extensively about the German experience in World War I and World War II. He's a former German army officer, and I've taken a tour with him and done lots of Zoom meetings, actually presentations that he's done. And while he doesn't pull any punches in terms of talking about the German experience in a way that I think is genuine and real, not so much admitting who's at fault. That's not what I mean. But I mean a genuine kind of experience. Really interesting, your binational experience that you bring to this topic. It's really fascinating, that your story, because when I first saw the book suggested by Mike, I thought, oh well, this is a German author and it's been translated into English, and it's not. So it's a primarily an English book. So
yeah. I mean that's with both sides. They can hopefully connect to it. Well, like you said, if it's like this was published, in England or the US, it's from someone in Germany. Not to say it won't be received, differently, but they won't have that connection to it, because I live, in the areas where these soldiers were raised and came from, and being from my English family, military men. My dad was in the Royal Engineers that Alexander fought against, so you think, well, my English, relatives fought in the First World War as well, not far from where Alexander fought. So it's like a blend of these two sides, and it's kind of a way to get that across. I just thought, that's why I wanted to self-publish the book in a way, because I thought I could, I wanted to be able to portray it the way I felt best, by myself, and telling that story, the story to be told by someone who is from both sides, so yeah, I mean, it's and even people at the event today said the exact same thing, like the coincidence of me, and this diary being in the north of England, where all these soldiers came from that he fought against. So just keep, I always go to Germany as well, when I can. Not so much compared to when I was younger, but yeah. And then when I'm there, it's like you talk to them, and kind of I always bring stuff back, from the First World War and so forth. So yeah, and I know in Vida as well in Germany, where Alexander was from. There's a lot of excitement there as well, about the book and so forth. Because a lot of the people there, the old generations, they knew my grandfather, so my mother's father. So it's, again, not just like a random English person. I'm like, in their eyes, I'm one of them. So it's, yeah, it's a good, like you said, makes the book a bit more unique and special.
Wow. Fantastic. Super cool. Cool. All right. Marty, anything else you'd like to ask, or good?
Yeah, I'm just curious about how extensively you've traveled the battlefields where Alexander served.
Yeah. So this April, the April just gone this year, my grandfather here in England, my grandfather's brother, in his mid-80s, they go on a trip every year, like a bit of a pilgrimage to, the battlefields of France, Belgium, and they literally go for 5 days, have like 2 cars, and they just go from site to site for hours, all day. And they took me with them, and they just found it fascinating. It was the first time I went with them, and they heard about the story, and they just really wanted me to have them there, because I was bringing a new perspective to their, this journey, this pilgrimage that they've been doing for 25 years. And I went to the places, particularly around La Bassée. I was stood on the area's exact spot where Mad Point was, where a lot of the pictures were taken that featured in the book. Obviously, it's just a field now, but going into the Hohenzollern Redoubt, looking at the area there, the field, standing in the, in the cemeteries and so forth, where all this stuff happened that gets talked about. There's a lot of the places, nothing really there. It's just fields and houses and roads. But when you look carefully, I found a grenade. I didn't touch it. You just found a grenade on the surface, bullets, shells sticking out the ground. I went to Souchez, the Loreto Heights, and where we saw his first proper combat and action. It really hit home. And then I read out some of the extracts to the people who I was with, just so they can get an idea of what actually happened here. It was mostly around, Arras, La Bassée. We went to some places that weren't related to Alexander's war journey, like Belgium and so forth. Ypres. I went to the Vimy Ridge, which was very special to me, because you got to see the battlefield. Practically untouched since after the war. So you could see the trenches, the mounds, of the carnage that happened. Everything was just churned up, and all the grass has just grown over it. So you get a real sense of what these men actually went through. But yeah, it was mostly France and those areas, and then just visiting the graves and the German, of both sides, German and British, and even other nationalities as well who were involved. The graves as well of the people who Alexander knew, who fell, and taking some of the items that belonged to them with me, and placing it on the grave. It was just absolutely phenomenal.
Wow. That's awesome.
And it's all in the book.
Yeah, folks, it's a fantastic book. Fantastic book. And you definitely need to get your hands on it. And right. So, folks, the book is The Other Trench, the World War I Diary and Photos of a German Officer. There will be links in the episode notes to the website and a link to where to buy the book. And Philip and Marty, thank you so much. Thank you both so much for coming on the book. Philip, to talk about the book. Marty, for attending. And I bet you didn't have I'm going to be on a podcast today on your bingo card, but here you are. All right. And we're richer for it, man. So, Philip, thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening.
Yes.
evening time in Britain there. So
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great. It's actually my first podcast since the book has been
awesome.
launched. So yeah, special day for me as well.
Oh, fantastic. All
Thank
right.
you very much.
Well, gentlemen, have a very good evening.